Well, welcome. Today's topic is writing a term paper. I'm Phil Hahn. I'm the professor for Coercion and Deterrence at MIT, Core 17.S.952. Today's topic is I'm not an expert. I'm just going to give you an overview of how I go about writing a paper and how I think about term papers. And if you've got a lot of experience and this doesn't work for you, then ignore it. But potentially it has may have some value for you. So let's get at it. So first, the question is, well, what is a term paper? I think of a term paper in a graduate school education as a fundamental building block. These are article length, the length of articles that you're going to be writing professionally. It gives you some experience with it in a big but not too big of project. So it's a big project. The other part of it is at the higher end of the type of learning that we want you to do as a graduate student. This level of analysis to the synthesis to creativity, this is higher level learning. Much of your graduate school course is on knowledge and criticism, but your dissertation, after you get to your general exams, is all about creativity and development. And so this is meant to be a bridge between the coursework and the critique that you become very good at and what we're going to be asking you to do for the dissertation, as well as what you're going to be doing for much of your professional career. It also is an opportunity for you to explore further either a potential dissertation topic or potential research agenda. So what are you interested in? Many term papers eventually are the first steps towards some type of published work, may turn into your second year paper or even parts of your dissertation. It also gives you an opportunity to work on your skills at theory development. Quite often in terms of inductive thinking. So with qualitative research, you take a case and figure out how to look at it and develop a model that explains that case. That can be one of the first steps for inductive theory development, or perhaps you have a theory you want to test, and a term paper can be a good way to go ahead and begin testing a theory. And there's other purposes for term papers. It can be initial stages of case development. If you know there's an important case or a very useful case, you can begin to do the very first steps towards the research during a term paper. I consider it the most important part of any course because it is active learning. You're not just sitting there reading other people's ideas, you're creating your own. And you're expected to go well beyond this idea of just knowing the field or being able to critique the field. The finished product of a term paper you can think of as your first draft. The first draft before you share it with others for critique. You know, because of the seminar series, that scholars are all the time bringing in work, sharing that work, trying to improve that work. This is the first step there, where you put together that first draft. There's gonna be issues with it. Term papers are never perfect. They're not meant to be perfect. It is that first step. And then the other part on a term paper is quite often people think about the product, but the product is not just the paper, the research itself. Part of the product is your thinking, the producer of that paper. I found that when I was a graduate student, that every term, my term papers improved. I would look back at earlier semesters term papers and say, boy, that wasn't very good. That's actually a good sign. It means that you're learning from the process. So the outcome of a term paper is not just the research on the paper, the findings of the paper, but how you improve as a researcher. So this is an opportunity for you to invest in yourself where you can get some feedback. It is a requirement of the course. It's half the course, but don't look at it as a chore or something added to the course. It is a key component of the course. Okay, so you're being assigned, I put in the syllabus a 25 to 35 page term paper that, Times New Romans 12, double spaced, normal margins. That's an 8 to 11,000 word term paper. That includes footnotes. Almost all of the materials you submit to publish, the page or the word count includes the footnotes, so you should get used to that. So this is about the length of a published article, and so you should start thinking about that. Okay, so for the rest of this lesson, we're going to talk about the question, some scoping, research, and organization. Try to bring up some questions to consider and potentially some tools that you might use. So first, the question. Term papers, research papers, attempt to answer a question. And in this case, I'm looking for you to try to answer a question relevant to the field of study of coercion and deterrence. And so when deciding upon a research question, and what I have is whenever I come up with a question, I put it in with my list of research questions, is always thinking about what's a good question? What's the paradox? Is there something that just doesn't make sense to you? Are you continually drawn back? What interests you the most about a subject? What seems important? And in the discussions, what's missing from the argument? Times change. So what's the most relevant aspect? That may not have been addressed before. And then you should always, I'd say, encourage your intuition. Don't be led around by it. Don't believe everything you think. But what does your intuition say? It's kind of a combination of these. And then as you approach a term paper, you really should come up with multiple ideas. Some of these are going to be turned into dead ends. You're either not going to find the resources, it's going to be too big of a project for a term paper. Having additional options really helps in project development to say, hey, you know what? That's just not the time for that term paper. And then when I'm thinking of the question, I quite often look at the who, what, when, where, why, how. And for a lot of the work that I do, I tend to go immediately to the how and the why. These are good questions for if you're trying to develop a theory, some type of explanatory power. How and why are good questions. So when someone asks you what the question is, that first word should give you some indication. If you go with the who, what, when, where, these are typically more narrative words, more empirics, that's descriptive of the data. This can be quite useful for a term paper, but it's at a different level. So, and you should be kind of careful with that in terms of what you want to achieve. So think about the question. Think about it all the time. What is the question I'm trying to answer? Okay, scope. Scoping is both an art and a science. And I want to talk about two aspects of it. The first is the time aspect. You're now under the gun. You've got to deliver a paper by the end of the term. There's only a relatively short amount of time to do this. You have other responsibilities. And the number one concern is what project is doable in the time frame that you are given. And with that, an understanding that for term papers, there is no room for perfection. Practical, good term papers are much turned in time are far preferable to perfect term papers that seem to never get turned in. Okay, so look at the time. The second aspect, and this has to do with actually conducting the research and all, is the breadth. So big questions are great to start with, but you're going to have to somehow chip away at those big questions and make it manageable for the research and the writing. So maybe you're interested in what do all nations or states do? Well, maybe you want to take that down to a single nation or state. What does the US do? What does China do? What does Russia do? Focusing on a single state for maybe the way to go. Or even inside that, what does an organization do? What does a military service do? What is any anything that gets away from that unitary unit? You may even want to go down to the individual level if there's a specific leader that you're interested in. How do you shorten the time horizons that you're interested in to make sure that what you're examining has enough information in it, but not doesn't overwhelm the amount of time? Can you get down to a single case? There may be multiple cases. Can you grab one case in particular and focus on, or only a couple of cases? Or maybe you want to focus most of your data on one case and then do what's called a shadow case, where it's outlined, but you don't do the same level of analysis. Other examples are, can you pick a specific regime type, an authoritarian regime, a certain type of authoritarian regime? Anyway, the key point is you don't have time to cover everything. And so you need to really pare down that question to something that's doable. So focus on the scoping early. Is this too big of a question? Is something you should be talking or thinking about. Finally, in terms of the actual research, I'm not going to talk about methods. You get that in other methods course. You'll pick whatever type of methods that's most applicable to the subject. You can use whatever method, although in this type of research, more often qualitative methods will be used for a course like this. It's not limited to that. If you have a data set and you want to do that, that's fine. Just talk to me. But the key is limit the research to what's readily available. Begin with the readings. This built this course around some important readings, and so a lot of the theory that you might use may be within these readings. It may not be perfect, but you're reading it and it may be good enough. How do you quickly expand that? Digital electronic journals are fairly easy to be able to take a look at. Other secondary sources are perfectly fine for a term paper. Largely for a term paper, you're not going to have time for archival research unless you've already done it and done some sifting of it. You don't have time to go buy a survey experiment, and interviews, maybe a one or two, but you got to be always concerned with interviews, particularly now with IRBs. So anyway, the expectations are not nearly as high as you might expect for a journal. It could be the start to a paper that could lead to a journal, which would require additional research, but this is a good start. And then on this research, your note-taking system is critical. And start at the very beginning. I don't pick up and look at any work that doesn't enter my bibliography. I immediately frame it, or I put it in the appropriate footnote manner. And if I end up having pages of footnotes, I don't use one of the other programs. You use whatever works for you. I'm not dissing any of the other type of programs for note taking. The key is to have an efficient use of time where you can readily get to those notes and be able to use them. There is a warning with that, which is one of the things that I do is, so if you store, however you store your research materials, that could either be hard copy or it could be electronic copy. I tend to mark them up either way so I can get to them, but my notes should give me key ideas, and it should have references to where I could go find the data or the quotation or whatever I'm going to use. Put it in your own words. My recommendation is not to do copy and paste of bits and pieces of different articles. That's just going to lead to potential problems with plagiarism. You let your note taking begin to form your own ideas by using your own words. Okay, so the research, it's on the very beginning. You should start it right away in conjunction with the other readings for the course. Now, for the organization of the course, and this is going to be for pretty much the remainder of this lesson, we'll talk a little bit about the time. You need to organize your schedule. Procrastination quite often is because you don't know where to start. And so it's that age-old adage of how do you eat an elephant? Well, it's one bite at a time. Well, it's the same thing with a term paper. There are steps and processes. You need to just start those, do bite-sized pieces, do a little bit every day, every week, make progress. Look at your semester schedule. You have other term papers, you have other requirements. Figure out where key elements fit in. Just because there's a May 10 deadline doesn't mean you have to wait until then to have the paper written. Procrastination is a killer of grad students, and it's a killer of good ideas because time is your most precious commodity. You cannot waste it. So developing some type of discipline on your time is going to be crucial, and developing those habits now is going to be critical to success. Okay, in part because in the past, when you were an undergraduate, you were an amateur scholar, and now you're becoming a professional scholar. So a lot of the excuses you used in the past no longer work. So let's become professional. Let's get a schedule out. Let's get ready to write a term paper that's going to be quality, that'll build towards your scholarship. Okay, so figure out how much time you're going to spend for the initial research on the front end of the course. Begin to scope down your question or questions. Come to me with the ideas, bounce them off me, bounce them off others. Let's come to some type of agreement what the question is, with the caveat that if you end up in a dead end at some point, change the question to something that is doable. And then one of the things I do is look at a date when you want to have that first rough draft complete. It should be well before 10 May. And the reason is you want to take some breathing time, even if it's a day or one night, to be able to look at the paper with fresh eyes. And that's where you can make some significant improvements and find some issues with your paper, is doing take a little bit of time away from it. And the other, now that we get to the structure, I've got different slides on the actual structure, but the structure of the paper kind of depends upon the method that you're using. Pick a structure that works for you. I'm going to talk about one specific, but one of the big, what I think benefits of structure is it prevents your paper from becoming distorted. Too often I've seen narrative sections or descriptive sections that have gone on and on for page after page. Way too much background, way too much detail. If you have a structure to keep it there, it prevents you from wasting a lot of time in those 15-page intros. Okay, so I'm going to turn to one template. This is one possible template for a term paper. I've actually adapted this from a talk I've given for years to professional military officers. I've kind of adapted it, but hopefully it'll work today. So first, as with any paper, you need an introduction. And in that introduction, so we're doing about a 10,000 word paper, you need to get the question that you have and the hook. The hook is important. It's the interest for the reader. Why is it that the reader wants to read about whatever question that you have? It can be a little blurb as far as you can think about a specific conflict or war where it's applicable, something on the interesting side, but quickly get into the question. And then where the question includes the scoping, and then you should shift from question to answer, which is the thesis. The thesis statement, it should be in there saying, this is the answer that I have for this question. And then with that introduction, I like to put in, I'm not a big fan of mysteries. When I read a paper, I want to know up front, what are you going to tell me? What's important? What should I be looking for? I don't have all day to read through this. And so providing that thesis statement up front and a roadmap for where the paper is going to go, for me, I find that to be quite useful. That's on the front end, okay? Now, the body of the paper. You're going to either dive into the question, the hypothesis, why are we getting to this point, the lit review, the introduction of data, that's the body. Let's talk about these. You really don't have in a term paper a lot of time to test a lot of multiple hypotheses. Pick a couple, one or two that are the most important. You may be able to pair up a couple hypotheses that are closely linked and be able to handle those. The lit review serves a couple purposes. Okay, first off, you'll use this lit review later if you do additional research on the topic. So you're writing part of the lit review for yourself. Much of that lit review can go into footnotes. Okay, yeah, because the other part of this is you're trying to convince the reader in a term paper, it's me, that you know what you're talking about, that you're building this research on other research, that you're aware of the field, and that you know what others have written on this. Now, you don't have to put every single book, every single article, put the important ones there, just so that someone who's aware of the field will look down and say, yep, this is credible. The lit review is important, but it should be condensed. You don't want to go crazy on it. And then the body of the paper also presents the data that you're going to use in order to support your thesis. And you can do that in whatever way you want, multiple points. Anyway, build that argument for your answer to the question that you have. So I put on there 4,000 words for the question hypothesis. That's a major chunk of a 10,000 word essay. But then about half that again is on the analysis. So you've pieced together this research question, you have some answer, and then you're going to analyze that. And it kind of depends upon what method you're using. Qualitative methods, you'd probably use a little bit more words because that tends to be what the data is presented in compared to quant. But anyway, analysis is where you really get into and demonstrate your understanding of the material and the argument you're trying to make. So between those two sections, that's 6,000 words. That is really the majority of your original thought comes in that area. But there's another section, and this is the alternatives. Think of this section as your answer to questions when you give this paper at a talk. So for instance, people are going to want to know, this is your hypothesis. This is what you think is, or here's the hypothesis and here's your thesis to that. But others would say that it's something else, right? So it's structure. Well, no, it's not structure. It's, individual leadership or something along those lines. Thinking through the major alternative explanations and being able to respond to those is important. Maybe it's on a methods level. I don't know how many times I've been in a talk and someone has said, what about selection effects? You should be able to talk to the weaknesses of your data. Your paper's only good as the data that is available. Talk to those weaknesses. Be able to answer those and explain why it is you've done the best that you can, given the time and the space that you have and the resources you have for this answer. Finally, leave space for the conclusion. And in the conclusion, what I typically do is I try to restate the question and the thesis. Here's my answer. And then quite often that paragraph or so, when you read that, is you're right. Typically, you'll write that at the end of the paper. There's no requirement to write in order. Um, but quite often that paragraph, I will move up to the intro because it really, you have a much better understanding of what the paper is then. Um, and then as a political scientist, you should always be asking the question of, so what? So what about this paper? Why is it important? What are the implications? Spend time at the end to think through not only the internal validity of your argument, but the potential external validity, right? So what does this mean, not only to this question, but potentially how could we expand this, right? And here's you're trying to think about, how am I going to take whatever I've scoped this down to and think about what are the next steps that would be useful in terms of using this research to answer other questions. Okay, so why did I put the order here? Again, one of the reasons to have the order here is to try to really frame, make your paper proportionate, try to be efficient. And I find having that type of order prevents me from going off the deep end as far as the analysis goes. Okay, so that's what I have for you today, with the final thoughts being, once you've written the paper, think about a title. Trying to do a good title is hard. It's a good hook. And I spent a lot of time with my research, particularly on books, trying to think of good titles that will catch the eye. Subtitles are typically explain what the book is. The subtitle is also subtitle explains what the article is really about. Subtitle is important to get keywords in for searches. And finally, the abstract. Spend time on the abstract. How do you get your 10,000 page term paper down to a paragraph? And that's important because you have to be able to develop your elevator answer or pitch. If you're stuck in an elevator going up 10 floors, how is it that you pitch what it is that you do in a meaningful way? Okay, so that's all I have time for you today. I hope you found this useful. We'll be going over this again in class about the term paper, but you should start thinking about it right now. Okay.